Welcome to the Leadership Lounge, a place to kick back and listen as our experts dissect some of the biggest questions leaders face today. I'm Emma Coombe, Leadership Advisor in our London office. Once upon a time, leaders were built to last. Now they must adapt. Today's markets don't respect 5-year roadmaps, and technology doesn't follow predetermined timelines. Transformation isn't a project anymore, it's the water we swim in. In today's episode, we're exploring what it really takes to lead in the age of perpetual transformation, from developing the mindset shifts that turn uncertainty into opportunity to building leadership teams that can execute strategy at the speed of change. We'll discuss why most transformation efforts stall before they start, and how the most effective leaders have evolved from decision makers to enablers. But before we dive in, remember to share any burning questions you want our experts to answer by emailing redefiners@russellreynolds.com. We look forward to hearing from you. And if you enjoy listening to our episodes, leave us a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify. So let's dive in. First up, we'd like to welcome Bob Marcus, Leadership Advisor in Russell Reynolds Associates New York office, into the conversation. Bob, welcome to the Leadership Lounge.
Thanks for having me, Emma.
Bob, we hear the word transformation spoken about a lot in boardrooms across the globe. But what do we mean by transformation? And why has it become particularly important in today's climate?
It's a great question, Emma. It is certainly the number one conversation that we're having with clients across the globe. Transformation is the idea that while change is evolutionary, it's always occurring in businesses every day. Because of the environment that we're living in, the volume needs to be turned up, that there's more intentionality to it, and that the scale of what needs to change inside organizations is larger than ever before.
Bob, your point about the volume being turned up is exactly right. What really strikes me is how much everything is accelerating. Technology cycles that once took years are now happening in months. Geopolitical shifts shape markets literally overnight. In fact, in our 2025 Transformational Leadership Study, we found that 73% of leaders state their organisation risks going out of business in the next 10 years if they do not make changes to their core business model, revenue model, launch new products, or find new markets. We'd now like to introduce another voice, Hetty Pye, Leadership Advisor in Russell Reynolds Associates London office, into the conversation. Hetty, welcome to the Leadership Lounge.
Thank you, Emma. I'm very happy to be here.
So, Hetty, transformation has shifted from episodic projects to perpetual adaptation. For a CEO listening who's concerned about burning out their team with yet another transformation program, how do you build a culture that thrives on continuous change?
Transformation is now a constant. It's here to stay. It's not some episodic period of change that has a beginning, middle, and an end. If I think about how to typify how we see the best leaders, and particularly CEOs leading into this, we have a phrase for them which we call the North Star CEO. And what does that mean? That means it's your ability to be able to present in a really concise, compelling, but consistent way what your ultimate ambition, your goal, your vision is for an organization. However, at the same time, you've got the dexterity to be able to tack nigh on continuously in service of that ultimate goal and ambition.
I love that North Star CEO concept, Hetty. I think in a world that is changing so fast, it's so important to have something that the whole team can remain steadfast upon. In my mind, it has to be quite a macro goal because then the execution of it has to adapt according to what's going on in the world around. But having that clarity, that flag planted of where the team wants to get to is hugely motivational. I'd now like to introduce Sean Dineen, Leadership Advisor in Russell Reynolds Associates Boston office, into the conversation.
It's great to be here, Emma. Thanks for having me.
Sean, it's great to have you with us. And how do you see leaders practically building this adaptive culture?
The idea of steady state operational is a thing of the past, and the environmental pressures are so high right now that CEOs really need to build adaptive cultures, and it needs to become kind of a superpower for the organization. And a lot of this means embracing thoughtful risks. It means embracing more experimentation, but also creating the conditions that reflect, that learn, that adapt. And a lot of times CEOs and senior leaders fall into the trap of driving this from a very kind of top-down hierarchical perspective and really driving and driving and driving. And that's a recipe for burnout. And what we're finding is that the best transformational efforts combine the clarity of kind of top-down conviction with a bottom-up grassroots approach where you're engaging the broader population of employees in a much more co-creative and adaptive practice. And that's really what we're encouraging CEOs to do as we think about helping them transform their organizations moving forward.
Exactly right, Sean. That balance between top-down conviction and bottom-up creativity is fascinating. And what you're essentially describing is distributed leadership, empowering people throughout the organization to be transformation agents rather than having that fixed hierarchy in place. Easier said than done, but lots of really good food for thought. I'd now like to turn back to you, Bob. Our 2025 Transformational Leadership Study found that less than half of leaders are confident in their executive leadership team's ability to drive successful transformation. What specific leadership behaviours separate the organisations that move at the speed of change from those that get left behind?
Certainly one is enterprise mindset. It's the ability to conceive of the whole enterprise, of all the pieces and parts that need to be brought together to produce desired outcomes. And most of us grew up focused inside of a single silo or inside of a single function or geography. And so it doesn't always come naturally to us to think about the enterprise as a whole, really until you get into the C-suite. The other thing that we talk to leaders a lot about and certainly hear a lot about is because the pace of change is so great, that the agility, not just intellectual agility, but the emotional agility that's required of leaders is greater than it ever has been before.
Having an enterprise mindset is absolutely critical, Bob. And what we're seeing is that C-suite leaders today have to forgo their natural inclination to fight for their team, their department, to fight for budget, for recognition, for capital allocation, and actually to first and foremost put the priority as solving for the whole and what the whole is going to do moving forward, because the world is changing so fast. That old leadership style of hub and spoke, where the CEO was connecting individually with each of their direct reports, is no longer effective. And it's so much more about a leadership team that works really effectively together across the organization. So, Sean, what behaviors do you see as important to continuous adaptation?
Yeah, adaptive leadership is often a result of a combination of different leadership competencies. It's really about flexing different muscles, managing different polarities depending on the context and situation that you're in. It's really situational leadership at its best. And in today's environment, with tons of volatility, tons of complexity, leaders are always managing competing priorities and polarities. So, for example, there are times when leaders will need to be more divergent. They'll need to be more disruptive in their thinking, be more longitudinal. They'll need to pick a point on the horizon that they're going to kind of go after with conviction. And at the same time, they need to be able to kind of be pragmatic in nature and translate that into a way that's realistic and accessible to the organization. There are times when they need to have a bias for action and take risks and move things forward with pace. And there are times when they need to bring rigor and systems and process. There are times when they need to lead from the front. There are times when they need to lead from behind.
Thank you, Sean. And adaptive leaders also need to be comfortable with productive conflict. As to the earlier point, we were talking about emotional resilience and emotional intelligence. But this only works when at the end there is one unified voice. You don't need to get to consensus, but you do need to get to a decision. And all leaders need to back that decision when they leave the room, regardless of whether or not they fully agree with it. We'd now like to welcome our final voice into the conversation, Alain Ishak, Leadership Advisor at Russell Reynolds Associates Montreal office. Alain, welcome to the Leadership Lounge.
Thank you, Emma. Happy to be here.
Alain, many leaders built their careers as expert decision makers, but often the most effective leaders today are enablers. That's a fundamental identity shift. What does this transition look like in practice? And why is it so psychologically difficult for senior executives?
The old model for leaders called for them to learn everything about the business, to be problem solvers. Now the world is so complex that it's virtually impossible. In fact, leaders need to go from the me concept to the team concept. They need to go from being problem solvers to facilitators, from telling to coaching, from blaming to learning, from risk management to innovation, from hierarchical management to creating collaborative networks, and most importantly, going from strictly being P&L managers to culture leaders. in order to transform yourself as a leader, you have to reimagine how you create value. You have to fight the feelings of loss of control. You have to find relevance in a different way and not be seen as the one needing to find a solution, not be seen as being the savior. In short, means being vulnerable and accepting that your success goes through the success of others.
Alain, you touched on something which is so psychologically challenging for many senior executives. But the fact is that change needs to be driven through organizations at all levels at an unprecedented pace. And it's only by giving ownership to very large groups of people and allowing them to help solve for that change that you can actually execute on these plans. So I think this whole piece is critical. It means being vulnerable, as you said. And for many leaders, showing that uncertainty or relying on others historically was seen as weakness, and maybe they still see it as weakness. But actually, we know it delivers much better results and creates a competitive advantage. Moving on to talk about culture, I'd like to turn it back to Bob. Bob, our research found that only 42% of leaders prioritize reshaping organizational culture as part of their transformation journey. Given that one CEO told us change is 30% technology, 70% culture, what's the disconnect here? And how do leaders close this gap?
What we believe at core is that organizations change when people change, and people change when leaders change. And it's critical that senior leadership learn how to role model and how to project the changes that they want to see in the world. And they have to recognize that inertia in a system, that habit in a system is very natural, that it's the role of leaders to confront that, but confront it with empathy, to understand that people are going to be skeptical or people are going to be in their habits. It's okay, but leaders need to then be very clear about what needs to change, how they themselves are going to change and are changing, and then be able to project that to the rest of the organization so it can be witnessed, understood, and replicated.
You're absolutely right, Bob. Culture change in an organization is complex and it's a very amorphous subject and hard to try and distill into something that's easy to understand. We definitely feel that many leaders underestimate culture change because it's hard to measure. And without doubt, it takes a huge amount of patience, a lot of consistency. I also find it really fascinating as a leadership advisor to reflect on internal versus external succession. We're spending a lot more time now developing internal succession options for our clients. And personally, I find this hugely rewarding. And I think that internal candidates who have had a real feel of what a legacy culture is like, but who can prove a clear ability to drive change and can articulate the kind of culture they want to have in the future, in my mind, their followership within an organization where they're already known and trusted makes that delivery of culture change so much easier. Coming back to you, Sean, when we look at AI implementation, we know that C-suite readiness, not AI proficiency, often determines success. What does AI-ready leadership look like?
AI enablement doesn't happen without great leadership. We like to say that the fish swims from the head, and ultimately leaders need to be the enablers of an AI-enabled and AI-ready organization. You can have the best technical infrastructure, you can have the best AI tools and agents, but unless your leaders are leveraging these tools and leveraging AI consistently and kind of creating the conditions and culture for this, it's never going to translate. And, it really starts with leaders embracing AI, role modeling it themselves in terms of how they set strategy, make decisions, in terms of how they execute and operate, how they build their teams. It really needs to be a red thread. And they need a degree of technological acumen. Again, when we were building our success profiles as part of CEO succession 18 to 24 months ago, boards were saying AI understanding was kind of a nice to have. Now it is at the top of the list, mission critical. And many leaders are still in this experimental phase and still getting comfortable with the technology. And they need to move beyond that and really thread this into every way that they're leading and operating.
It's an interesting observation, Sean. I'm actually seeing quite different role specifications, and maybe it's to do with the different geographies that we operate in. Top of ours are still very much leadership requirements and ability to help people be empowered, to help them to ace their briefs, to learn and step up into new roles and responsibilities. Of course, technology cuts across it all, but as we have said, without the right leadership and without the right culture, that tech-enabled change can't happen. And in my mind, every generation has had big change to face into. The AI change does for sure feel unprecedented, but we are already hearing some mood music that an over-reliance on AI reduces individuals' ability to think critically, and that actually the output is less effective than something done from scratch by individuals, by humans. So I think the mood music might become a bit more muted. And for me, this is less of a priority in roles that we're solving for. But Sean, of course, AI is a big topic. And going back to your point about moving beyond the experimental phase, our research found that 30% of leaders are in the piloting phase when it comes to AI implementation. What's holding organizations back from moving beyond that pilot phase?
I think one useful way for leaders to think about how they might do this is to take more of a process orientation. We have one client that's doing this right now. They've gone out and they've mapped out the 10 or so core processes in different parts of their organization, and they've started to identify where is there friction in those processes. One of the things that AI is really good at is removing friction. So mapping out those core processes end to end and thinking about how do we kind of thread AI through those core processes, and building momentum around that starts to kind of build that systematic engineering into the organization that then will ultimately translate and move beyond this kind of test and experiment phase.
Sean, I think that process-oriented approach is great. Obviously, the quality of the data is what slows down a huge amount of organizations. But I have certainly been stunned by what agentic AI can do now. I attended a seminar with Applied AI. They have mapped 1.2 million of what they see as 2 million finite number of workflows. And they have the code all set up to input where agentic or agents can do the work and where human intervention is needed. As a live audience, we gave one question, and within about 5 seconds, 800,000 lines of code had been generated and a whole workflow mapped with all of the agents, the AI agents, and then where human intervention was required. It was quite mind-blowing. And if the quality of data can allow for that kind of input, I think it's going to be truly transformational. So we've almost reached the end of the episode. But before we go, if you had to give one piece of advice to a leader who wants to move their organization from reacting to change to creating change, what would that be? Hetty, if you could kick us off.
So I think a really good thing to think about if you're a CEO, and something that we've seen work very well, is have the temerity, the bravery, the boldness to actually have one or two very carefully selected strategic disruptors sitting around that leadership table. What you need from them and require from them is to drive positive difference, ask different questions, challenge that status quo. But accept, however, that the trade in that bargain is they're probably going to bump into your culture every now and again, and you've got to kind of accept that that's okay.
That's a super point, Hetty. It's not always going to feel comfortable, but it might drive better results. Alain, what would your advice be?
It would be allow for failure to exist. This is how people learn. Quick anecdote on this. I was working with a CEO in a financial services organization a couple of years ago who was telling me that there's no innovation in his organization. And then I looked up and I saw a cup on his on one of his shelves from the Apollo 13 movie, when one of the characters says, "Failure is not an option." And I said, "What's that cup?" And then he explained to me what it was. He says, I think this is so cool. I had cups made for everyone. And then I said, this is why your organization is not doing so well, because you don't let people fail. You don't let people learn. You block innovation.
And what about you, Bob?
Lead loudly. Leaders need to fill the space. They need to fill the vacuum of uncertainty that's created when things change. An organization cannot outperform its leadership. And so when things are changing, it's leaders who have to fill that vacuum, who have to be clear about their expectations, about why things are changing, about how employees will see them change. What are the changes that the leaders themselves are making?
Thank you, Bob. That's a great point. And last but not least, Sean, what would your parting piece of advice be?
So my piece of advice would be for all leaders to have a clear sense of where they're going, what that vision is for the future, and conviction around that. In such heightened times of ambiguity, of uncertainty, this is really what employees are looking for. This is what customers are looking for. This is what shareholders are looking for. And if we use a sailing analogy, the best leaders will pick a point on the horizon in terms of where they want to go. They'll realize that it's not going to be a linear path to get there. They're going to get blown off course. They're going to hit some rough waters. But their job is to kind of continually steer the organization back on course without losing a sense of where they're going.
Those are 4 really powerful pieces of advice. Having strategic disruptors, giving permission to fail, leading loudly, and maintaining unwavering vision. So, our time in the lounge now has come to an end. In 30 seconds, this is what we've learned. Transformation is no longer episodic, it's perpetual. The most effective leaders maintain a consistent vision while demonstrating tactical agility. To successfully transform, leaders must be confident flexing between different leadership styles as situations demand. The shift from decision maker to enabler is psychologically challenging but essential. Leaders must accept their success flows through others' success. Organizations change when people change, and people change when leaders model the transformation they want to see. If you have any topics or burning questions you'd like us to cover in future episodes of Leadership Lounge, then please get in touch. Email your questions to redefiners@russellreynolds.com. And if you've enjoyed listening to this episode, leave us a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify. You can find us on LinkedIn and follow us on X @RRA on Leadership. You can also find us on Instagram @Redefiners Podcast. Until next time, goodbye.